Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. During 2021, the State Historical Society is commemorating the upcoming 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood. In March, which is Iowa History Month, the Iowa History 101 webinar series expands to every Tuesday and Thursday starting at noon. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Today we will learn more about the stories about Iowans featured in the new exhibit, Iowa's Peoples and Places, which opens on March 5. Iowa's Peoples and Places invites visitors to explore the stories and artifacts of the earliest people who called this land home, as well as more recent Iowans who have helped make Iowa truly unique. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are now available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, State Curator Leo Landis. Leo has his Bachelor's of Science in History from Iowa State University and a Master's of Arts in Historical Administration from Eastern Illinois University. He has completed all but his dissertation towards a PhD in history from Iowa State. His museum experience includes time at Living History Farms in Urbandale, Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana, and 8 years as curator at Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. He has also worked as a curator and director of education at Salisbury House in Des Moines. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Leo to begin the webinar.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, Matt, and thank you to all of our attendees today. And as Jennifer said, we are opening a new exhibit at the State Historical Museum on Friday, March 5th. The exhibit is titled Iowa People and Places. It covers almost 13,000 years of Iowa history. The topics we used are based on a framework that was developed on American history at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. We, with our Teaching Iowa History Advisory Group, adapted that to be more Iowa-centric. And for this exhibit, we actually adapted it to fit both into our mobile museum, which will be traveling the state, we hope later this summer, and also our Iowa 175 exhibit, Iowa People and Places. So the way we divided up the sections that you'll see in the museum exhibit, or if you happen to see the mobile museum, is one that talks about the first peoples, the native nations of the land that becomes Iowa, and then how we became part of the United States and into the Civil War era, then statewide settlement, a new century, talking about the beginning of the 20th century, optimism and crisis of the late 20th century, and then Iowa in a global world. And so we'll talk about each of those sections today. Our first people section, and we really do always try to tell stories of the native nations of our state. Our state takes its name from the Iowa people who now are in Kansas, and one part of the nation is in Oklahoma. And so Lance Foster did a really excellent Iowa 101 presentation on the Indians of Iowa. You should go back and watch that. And also the Meskwaki people and the Ho-Chunk or Winnebago people still have a strong presence in our state. So really wanted to make sure we covered that. I'll move through these first sections pretty quick just to give you an overview of some of the topics, and then we'll move into a little more detail on the museum exhibit. And then that Becoming Americans section does deal with from the period after the Louisiana Purchase up to the Civil War era, as I referenced in the introduction. And so our territorial capitals get referenced, how we became a state, then moving into the Civil War period that really did define us and disrupted our settlement quite a bit. And then with statewide settlement, as I said, the Civil War really does put a halt to the coming of new communities. So really that northwestern quarter of our state has a 5 to 10 year period where people just do not have the opportunity to go there. Men are serving in the military, so you don't see as much immigration with an E coming to Iowa or immigration with an I coming to Iowa in that Civil War period. But after the war, then you really do see our state developing. And then the new century, as I said, that's taking us into the 20th century. This is one where we really did combine what would normally be two periods from 1897 to whether you want to take 1929 and the beginning of the Great Depression. That really was a formative period. And then going from 1930 and the Great Depression to from an Iowa standpoint, the World War II period into 1963 really could be divided up for purposes of the museum exhibit and our mobile museum. Really did feel like this was one that we could put together and really grateful to the Ayala and Rivera family who donated this photograph. It's a family who came to Iowa, two families who came to Iowa to work both in the sugar beet industry and on railroads in the 1920s, both in Webster and Kossuth County. And so a nice shot of Aurora Rivera on the left, Isabel Rivera in the center, and then John Ayala on the right. That's a Chevrolet automobile. I think it's a 1933 as I looked at it closer in the full image. And so really talking about transitions in our state. And again, we'll move to specific topics here in just a minute. And then that period from 1964 looks at the pre-Vietnam into the Vietnam era. Really US forces start going into Vietnam in 1965 in a larger way. And so it's a period where Governor Ray is a new governor in 1969, elected in 1968. In his second year of service, he launches and so 1970 launches the Place to Grow campaign. And the period really starts off on a high point, but then as land prices increase and farmers become more in debt, then the farm crisis starts to shape our state. By 1986, land prices had plummeted in the early 80s. They're starting to rebound by 1986. Certainly would listen to the argument that the farm crisis isn't quite over by 1986, but prices are starting to rebound. So that's how we chose that date. And then with the renewed population growth in our state through immigration, Ambassador Branstad's role as governor, and then Governor Vilsack's role, also Governor Culver and Governor Branstad and Governor Reynolds again, or Governor Branstad again, and then Governor Reynolds really engaging Iowa in a global world with trade missions and also again immigration beginning in the mid to late 70s in a new way in our state, but really taking off in the 80s, 90s, and current period. And then the idea that wind energy, biodiesel, and ethanol are a big part of the Iowa economy and the Iowa landscape. And so we'll talk about some of those stories too. Let's talk about that section that is the First Peoples, then in the sub-themes in that area. And I'll also show you some of the artifacts that we have in each section. The images are some maps showing Native nations and how they lived in Iowa. know they're small, but if you come into the gallery, they'll be a little more viewable. So those are the three maps on the right in the image. And then the three women in the background are three Ho-Chunk or Winnebago women. And the Ho-Chunk people were historically in what is Wisconsin. Some Ho-Chunk people stayed in Wisconsin. Some were removed to Western Iowa and actually Fayette County for a time. So the neutral land that is in Iowa maps of the 1830s and 40s, that's the Ho-Chunk people or Winnebago people are there. And then that nation is moved to Western Iowa and Eastern Nebraska. And so the photo of the three women is actually from Tama County. So we presume that they were visiting, this is a group of Ho-Chunk or Winnebago women visiting some Meskwaki people. And then the inset image is Wachamani, who was an Iowa chief and was instrumental in negotiations that forced the Iowa out of our state. And so again, we like to recognize the Native peoples and especially point out that Native nations do still have a presence in our state. They're thriving communities, and really acknowledge their elders and the people who were here before us. And so some of the artifacts besides the materials connected then to Native nations, and just to show some of those, we do have some points that will be in the exhibit. And the points, it's important to realize that bows and arrows did not come around till fairly late in Native nations settlements in Iowa or presence in what would become Iowa. So the points that are on the 6 points on the left, those really are likely scrapers or spear points and not arrowheads. So when we talk about things, we'll talk about points, not arrowheads per se, unless we're talking about the two items that are on the right. And so several thousand years ago, not 10,000 years ago, bows and arrows come into use. And so we talk about those transitions in technology for Native nations, and also point out that while lead mining is used as a push factor for or a pull factor, excuse me, for Europeans to come to Iowa. And so you see a bullet mold and a bullet on the right in that image on the lower left. That's a lead ball, and that was really the first industrial economic enterprise, and the Meskwaki were the ones who allowed Julian Dubuque to begin lead mining in the late 1700s in the region along the Mississippi. So it really was an industry, a technology mining lead that Native nations and especially Meskwaki who had come to our state relatively, or what would become our state, relatively recently. The Meskwaki had been a Great Lakes tribe who were forced out of the Great Lakes. They had a long alliance with the Sauk people, and so came to the Mississippi River Valley around the present day Quad Cities and a little east of that, and then were living along the Mississippi at different times too, a little farther north. So when Julian Dubuque is interested in lead mining, it's the Meskwaki, as I said, who really are overseeing that region of the Mississippi that is present day Dubuque. And then another artifact that is really one of my favorites in our collection, and I have to watch myself or I'll get too bogged down in telling stories, but this is a little shoulder bag, perhaps for holding maybe some plant material, sacred plant material. It has a figure on it called an underwater panther, which is part of the spiritual belief system of a lot of Great Lakes tribes. And so if my pointer shows up, the underwater panther is actually on the shoulder straps. And so it has a long tail that wraps around its body. The head is going to be there. It has 4 legs, and so it's a panther or a puma that lives in the water. And so this is obviously a special bag connected to a Great Lakes nation, and it was connected to the Meskwaki. And so really, really fabulous Meskwaki related artifact. And then perhaps one of the most significant artifacts. And so when we talk about this exhibit, we really wanted to feature some of the gems of our collection that haven't been displayed in our museum, sometimes for a couple of decades, sometimes even longer. And this is 2 sheets of paper from about 1830. They would have been joined by wax. And so the 3 little red dots are likely wax that was holding the 2 pieces together. And there's been some really good scholarship on this. We'll send this out as a link. Gaylord Torrance who's a Drake professor and a curator then down at Nelson Atkins, and Jack Musgrove, who was a former curator, have done some really good work. This piece was done by a Meskwaki elder named Wakashashi. Wakashashi was friends with George Davenport, the founder of LeClaire and Scott County town of Davenport, namesake of that town. And they had a close relationship. And so the belief is that Wakashashi wanted to present to George Davenport a document expressing important creatures to Wakashashi and the Meskwaki people, but also to to himself and events in Wakashashi's life. So, on that top sheet, there is a bison hunt with men on horses. And so that's what you see up on that upper left section. There also are a couple of battle scenes, and you'll see lines of power sometimes going from either the creatures or from a defeated enemy to Wakashashi. So the belief is that anytime there's a central figure engaged in a battle or a conflict, it's going to be Wakashashi. So staying on the top part of the screen, there's a small little scene there. And this is all hand drawn in ink. So it is one of, if not the oldest ink drawings by a member of a Native nation that's known. It's been to the Metropolitan Museum in New York as part of a traveling exhibit a few years ago. It was at the Nelson Atkins Gallery down in Kansas City. Went to the Quai Branly in Paris as part of a traveling display. And so this is a really significant artifact. We honor the Meskwaki people, and we're privileged to have it in our collection. And again, it's believed it came from the Davenport family to the State Historical Society or the State Historical Department in the early 20th century. The lower half, you'll see animals like a bearded turkey there, different large mammals, looks like perhaps a moose. And again, Wakashashi being from a Great Lakes nation in the late 1700s, early 1800s, would have been seeing moose either along Lake Superior or Lake Michigan at times. There are bear, bison, elk, wildcats, a beaver in a trap. There you see the beaver's tail, probably a crane, snapping turtles, maybe a box turtle of some sort, another battle scene with Wakashashi, again, drawing power from the animals in nature, which is part of the belief system of the most Native nations. And so Wakashashi, again, engaged in a battle and killing a enemy. And so this is a really important and significant document showing the belief systems of Native peoples, and especially with the Meskwaki people, a people still in our state. So would encourage you to come and really spend some time looking at it and reflect on the Native peoples who are still in our state and have a long history in our state. The Becoming American section, three themes within that section of the exhibit are the Louisiana Purchase, religion, and Civil War. And so, as I said, this is a period where we are now part of the United States. Then the Iowa Territory is established on July 4th, 1838. The bill is actually introduced to make us a state on March, I think it is 3rd. So tomorrow will be the 176th anniversary of the bill to make Iowa a state, along with Florida. So that's why March makes sense for Iowa History Month. And do follow the Historical Society on social media this month, but all the time, to see different information on Iowa History Month. But the border for Iowa was actually extending up into Minnesota, and the US Congress didn't want a new state that large. And so the initial bill for statehood was amended and reintroduced in 1846, and then was signed by President Polk on December 28th. And then we also talk about some of the factors leading up to the Civil War and Iowa's role in that, with the Underground Railroad and sympathy toward John Brown on the main label. And also then the aftermath of the Civil War. And really, though Reconstruction doesn't affect Iowa in the way that it affects the South, the issues of equality that come out of the Civil War are important. And so we talk about that Iowa did have segregated schools through the Civil War in larger towns with Black populations, and even after the Civil War. And so reference the Clark case in 1868, but know that Keokuk was still segregating its high school into the 1870s. Des Moines had a segregated school until 1874, and Dubuque was the last town we know of that was trying to segregate its schools into 1877. And so in today's talk, giving you maybe a little more detail, that if we had all the time in the world or all the space in the world and all your attention, we would share in museum labels. But today you're getting me talking about some of those stories that we weren't able to include. The pieces you see here on the right are actually two Peace, P-E-A-C-E, medals. They would have been gold or silver. In this case, they're silver, and were presented to leaders of Native nations as emissaries of the US government were traveling through territory controlled by Native nations. And so it would have the president's portrait on it. One of them is James Madison, and the other is Stephen Tyler, if I remember right. And so these would have been presentation medals to let or encourage American Indians, Native peoples, to be friendly to the emissaries. On the reverse side was usually a pair of shaking hands and the word peace. And of course, as Native nations became aware of their removal over time, probably the idea of peace and friendship was becoming more and more hollow for the people of Native nations. Then the two pieces on the left, one is Governor Kirkwood, our first Civil War governor's pocket watch, and then his spouse, Jane Kirkwood, her calling card case. So a nice mother of pearl calling card case. Jane Kirkwood is a great story in her own right. Governor Kirkwood, of course, leads Iowa through the early Civil War, but Jane Kirkwood, like so many women, is helping the war effort. And so we have a pair of knitting needles, or a set of knitting needles, I should say, it's more than a pair. We have a set of knitting needles from her that are in our mobile museum that she used to knit items for Civil War soldiers. Well, Jane Kirkwood was born in 1821. So she was in her 30s during the Civil War. She lives to be 99 years old. So her knitting needles that are in our mobile museum, she also used those through 1917 and 1918 to knit items for World War I soldiers. So just a really typical example of the efforts Iowa women made, both in the Civil War and in her case in World War I, to assist soldiers from the United States. Dorothy Schweeder, and I'll do a quick plug for our Iowa book club that's coming up later this month, March 11th, if I remember the date right, is 7 o'clock. And we're talking about Dorothy Schweeder's book, Iowa, The Middle Land. And Dorothy was one of my graduate school professors at Iowa State. She's now deceased, often called the den mother of Iowa history by Tom Moraine and others. And when Dorothy would talk to us about Iowa history in the Midwest, she would say there's no factor more important in Iowa history in the 19th century and even into the 20th century than religion. And so that was a story we certainly wanted to cover. We had a recent donation of a Dutch Bible going back to the 1600s. So it's over almost a 500-year-old Bible at this point, that a family coming from the Netherlands brought to Iowa, kept their family history in it, the births and deaths of their family. And so really representing faiths of all backgrounds in our state, but a good 19th century story. The Van Wyck family, who was mostly in Marion and Jasper County in the 1800s, brought their Bible, one of their Bibles with them. And so it was something that was important to them and guided their experience as new Americans and being Iowans. So really privileged to have this in the collection that came as a donation just a couple of years ago. And then again, to the level of the importance culturally is the Wakashashi drawing is the flag of the 1st Colored Regiment of Iowa, also known as the U.S. 60th Colored Troops. This was a regiment raised out of Iowa of Black men not allowed to vote. Iowa, as we said, had segregated schools in the 1860s, so their children weren't allowed to attend the local schools, had to go to segregated schools. And I should say a regiment's about 1,000 men. In this regiment, about 20% were from Missouri, and then about another 20% were from Iowa. So a lot of these were enslaved men who had come to Iowa and wanted to fight on behalf of the Union and on behalf of our state. This flag was made by the Black women of Keokuk and Muscatine. And initially, when Alexander Clark, a Black man of Muscatine, who we referenced earlier, is instrumental in Iowa history from the 1840s to the 1880s, approaches Governor Kirkwood. Governor Kirkwood, being prejudiced and racist like most Iowa men at least, did not want to allow Black men to serve. So it's not until 1863 that Blacks are allowed to serve in the US military officially, after the Emancipation Proclamation. And so then Alexander Clark and other Black men in Iowa start organizing a regiment of Black men to serve under an Iowa banner. And as I said, this is a banner representing Iowa. And this is the first colored regiment of Iowa, made by women of Keokuk and Muscatine, Black women. And those gaps, the creamy color is the original section of the flag that remains. Where you see gaps between the creamy color, and I'll just try to move my cursor through. So that's areas where the flag is just gone. This is a flag that was hanging at the state capitol into the 1970s. Then recognizing the damage that was occurring to these flags, this one was stabilized. And so the canton, the blue section there, is still in pretty sound shape, but the weight of the silk flag was pulling itself apart and the silk was shattering through. It came to the State House probably in the 1890s and hung in the state capitol in the alcoves on the first floor into the 1970s. So we are very fortunate that as much of this flag is still extant. And these, again, are men who do not have the right to vote. Their children can't go to the same schools as white children, and yet a number of these men give their lives at the Battle of Wallace's Ferry in 1864, and a number of them die of disease as well. So a really important artifact in the state collection that we'll have on display for the opening. And because these flags are light sensitive, it won't stay up likely through the full run of the exhibit. The same with the Wakashashi exhibit. So if you're watching today, again, would encourage you to come see the flag on display. So the next section, statewide settlement, the themes we look at there are migration and immigration, railroads, Chautauquas, and populism. And the scene on this panel is actually Missouri Valley, Iowa. It comes out of our Iowa City collections. My colleagues, Mary Bennett and Charles Scott, are always helpful helping locate images. They're based in Iowa City. Likewise, my colleague Becky Plunkett here in Des Moines. So always really grateful to the assistance I get from my colleagues in creating exhibits that we hope are engaging for all of you. And that's one of the things, because this is talking about statewide settlement, the Missouri River border in Monona County and Harrison County, in the case of Missouri Valley, is actually settling or having Euro-American settlers come in right around the Civil War. But Woodbury County, Sioux City, north, in the 1870 census, O'Brien County and Plymouth and Sioux County, there are under 250 people living in each of those counties. So 1870, Iowa is just getting back on its feet as a new state with some of the best soil in the nation. So this is an important period in our state's history. And so one of another new acquisition, and when people donate things to us, we can't always guarantee that things are going to go out on display right away, but if we have a natural fit for a story, like the settee or the love seat on the right, that comes from the Groth family of Sioux County. Samuel and Sarah Groth had both lived in eastern Iowa. They were Norwegian immigrants. Sarah actually worked for Anna Larrabee, and before he was governor, William Larrabee, as a house servant, and they marry and then move to western Iowa in the late 1870s, early 1880s. And so this is a settee or a love seat used in the Groth family home in western Iowa. So a great story connected to the development of new communities in western Iowa, a successful farm family, and also an immigrant family. So really great artifact. And that was just donated in the last year and a half. And so I need to reach out to the family who donated them and say, hey, just so you know, that artifact you donated is on display. And another immigrant story is the Wachier pottery that is on the lower two shelves in the case. There is a little wall hanger of an ear of corn. I know that's a little tough to see. Two little candle holders that are acorns, a little kind of ornament of a wooden shoe, and then a frog on the lower section. And John Nelson was a potter who came to Wachier, and I know I don't say that quite right for people from the area, but he actually comes a little bit after the time period that we look at. He's in the early 1900s, not quite in that 1896 period, but still a good immigrant story. His family was Swedish, and they actually come down from Red Wing, Minnesota as a family of potters out of Red Wing and set up the pottery in Keokuk County, I believe is where Wachier is. If I'm off, I'm not too far off. So another set of new collections. John Nelson's granddaughter lived in Warren County. She collected these things after she passed. Her son, so it would be John Nelson's great grandson, offered them to us. And so really honored to have this great collection of Wachier material. And we do have more. That's always the struggle, is when somebody gives us a great collection, we often can't put everything on display. And then the left side of the case, and sorry I don't have great images of these, are some land deeds on the top and a railroad pass, a clock used in the Des Moines Railroad Depot. And then on the lower section of that case are 2 ballots for the Greenback Party. And James B. Weaver, who was a Civil War general out of Bloomfield, was a popular Greenback Party member, actually elected to the US Congress, was nominated as president on the Greenback ticket, and then becomes the first president, first Iowan to get electoral votes in the 1892 election as the populist or People's Party candidate. And so we have some Greenback. They supported the printing of paper money, green dollar bills, essentially. And so that's why they were known as the Greenback. It was a blend between farmers. Iowa farmers are upset because they aren't getting as much profit off their farm crops as they had been during the war. And so in the 1870s and 1880s, into the 1890s, the Greenback Party and the Populist Party are really a major competitor to the Republican Party. It was a schism really within the Republican Party where the Greenbacks are able to, and some Democrats join them as well, to get more political power in the state. And so we talk a little bit about that party as well. And then as a last artifact connected to statewide settlement, we've got a quilt that comes out of Hamilton County. We know some of the names on it are from Ellsworth, some are from Webster City, other surrounding communities from Webster City, but this came from the Anderson family. Again, another fairly recent donation, and was a good representation. These are quilt blocks from different people within Webster City and surrounding communities. So Jewell is probably represented as a Hamilton County town as well. That's where the Anderson family and then eventually was living for a time. But in the middle of the quilt, and I'll bring up a larger image of another section, but is probably a block in the town of Webster City. And then you can see on the enlarged block, community groups like the Busy Bees, who embroidered their name on this block, and it's the 1886. So this falls right in that period as you're getting community growth through north central Iowa, as well as the western part of the state. And so a really great artifact to tell that story of statewide settlement. Oh, excuse me there. In our New Century section, we talk about African-American families, women's suffrage, the 2 world wars, and that's something we do a little better, I think, in this display than we do in our mobile museum version of the People and Places exhibit, the Great Depression and the Cold War. And so this is a big chunk, as I said, by most standards. We would usually talk about this in 2 sections, but reference the development of coal mining and the attraction of coal mining to Black workers in our state, also railroad workers in the 1900s, and then the relationship of Carrie Chapman Catt of Charles City and the 19th Amendment and Iowa women's suffrage efforts. Also, as I said, families like the Rivera and Ayala families coming from states like Texas or from Mexico, while immigration is still a little relaxed in the 1920s until 1924. And so talking about those stories into the Great Depression and the World Wars and the Cold War. So some of the artifacts in this section, we've got the charter for the NAACP of Des Moines, which is on the far left of the right image, far left document, a roll of honor that's both World War I related and Black African Americans in Iowa related. It's a list of 150 men who were Black Iowans serving on behalf of the state in the Great War, World War I. We've got a couple of items from the Patton collection. There's a calendar from the Crescent Beauty School, which was a Black beauty school established in Polk County, owned by a Black woman, Pauline Humphrey, and also a wedding invitation connected to the Black community. Luther Glanton, who was the first Black judge in Iowa, was one of the people in the wedding party. his wife, Willie, was the first one of the first blacks to serve in the Iowa legislature. So some really great artifacts connected to blacks in Iowa, some great images from our collections as well. See a suffrage sash connected to women's suffrage in Iowa. Of course, Iowa women don't aren't given is not the right word, aren't valued by, their opinions aren't valued by Iowa men enough, so they are not given the vote, or don't have the vote. That's the way to think about it, until 1920, the 19th Amendment. So we talk about the Iowa role in women's suffrage, both statewide and then nationally. The trophy in the background connects both to agriculture and to the Wallace family. Henry C. Wallace was a Secretary of Agriculture. His son, Henry A. Wallace, was a Secretary of Agriculture. And in the early 20th century, in an effort to promote better corn varieties, the Wallaces created a trophy for the best 50 ears of corn. And so that's what you see there. And then I actually overlooked a really significant little artifact there in that case, which is Edward Carter's medicine bag. Edward Carter was the first black man to earn a medical degree from the University of Iowa. And so that's another really significant piece. His daughter sent it to the State Historical Museum in the 1960s when the town of Buxton, where he practiced medicine, he had grown up in Oskaloosa area, went to Oskaloosa High School. When the town of Buxton shut down, there were not enough opportunities for a black doctor in Iowa in the early 1920s. So he moved to Detroit, where the black population was thriving in the auto industry. So our state was constraining him based on his race for the most part. It wasn't that he wasn't a good doctor. He had a thriving practice in Buxton. It was once that integrated community dissolved, he didn't have enough economic opportunity in our state, or didn't see it. So that's a really important artifact connected to Black Iowans. The Wallace Trophy, though, is a really striking example of the improvements in agriculture, and connected to Henry A. Wallace. As I said, his father was really leading the family business at the time. But Henry A. Wallace goes on to become Secretary of Agriculture during the Great Depression, and creates what would really be the modern Department of Agriculture we know today. Then on the left is a sheepskin coat that was given to Roswell Garst, from rural Coon Rapids. And Garst was a major figure in Iowa in the post-World War II era. Nikita Khrushchev comes to Iowa at his request to see Iowa agriculture. Roswell Garst had gone to the Soviet Union. And so really an Iowan taking on diplomacy as a private citizen to improve relationships between the US, Iowa, and the Soviet Union. So that's when he got that coat. That cloak is a gift he received from Nikita Khrushchev when he was visiting the Soviet Union. Just a close-up shot of the honor roll. Wanted to reference that again. So a really important document, hand-drawn. In some cases, there were pre-printed honor rolls that would have soldiers from a regiment. For whatever reason, a Black artist in Des Moines did this, or Des Moines area, I should say, Polk County, we think was a man from just north of Des Moines who did this, a man named Baker. Then the Optimism and Crisis section talked a little bit about Governor Ray, and really having Iowa renewing its efforts to bring in immigrants through Governor Ray, and the relationship with Southeast Asian immigrant communities. Also talking about the farm crisis, as I referenced, and the place to grow for people of a certain age in Iowa. That's a well-known symbol. And so really saw that as kind of a dual story there of the optimism that begins the mid-1960s, as we said, with the Vietnam war, it starts to ebb, and the relationship we have then with Southeast Asians, but also talking about equal rights, the farm crisis, and space race. And so some equal rights stories, again, a couple of other recent donations. Iowa Supreme Court Justice Linda Newman, the first woman to serve on the Iowa Supreme Court, she donated her robe that will be on display. She also donated her name badge, a coffee cup that she was given by the Chief Justice at the time. That is not in the exhibit. It's part of the Justice Newman's donation to us. And then the gavel and the outline of the state of Iowa belonged to former Lieutenant Governor, the late Janet Zimmerman, the first woman to serve as Lieutenant Governor of the state of Iowa. And at the time in the 1980s when she was elected, the Lieutenant Governor actually did preside over the Iowa Senate. And so that's her gavel and her platform in the outline of the state of Iowa that was used by Janet Zimmerman. In the space race, we do have some James Van Allen materials on display, but we also highlight the slightly later story. And Peggy Whitson was friends, or acquainted, I should say, with Dr. Van Allen at University of Iowa. He actually tried to dissuade her from pursuing a career as an astronaut. But we take the space race into a 20th century story, or 21st century story in the case of Peggy Whitson here, but we do have some material connected to Dr. Van Allen in the display. Another equal rights story that is represented both in our museum exhibit and the mobile museum is Gene Robinson, who ran track for Iowa State in the 1970s for a year, and then was an athletic assistant, or a kind of a team manager. And her mother was a really excellent seamstress, but Iowa State was not supplying uniforms for their female track athletes in the early 1970s. Jean enrolled in fall of 72. And so Jean's mother sewed her track uniform that's in our mobile museum and her warm-up suit. So this is an Iowa State women's track warm-up top from about 1972, sewn by a Jasper County woman, because in that pre-Title IX era, equality in opportunities wasn't quite where it is today for women athletes. And so another really great story to share. And then connected to the farm crisis, the family of Dixon Terry, who was an Adair County farmer near Greenfield. He was active in the Jesse Jackson campaign of 1988, was friends with Willie Nelson, John Mellencamp, active in the farm aid movement of that period, and was tragically killed in the summer of 1989 by he was out making hay and by a lightning strike. And so he was only 39 years old when he was struck by lightning, and was a nationally significant farm leader. And so his family donated some materials to us, Linda Terry, Dusky, and Willow Terry. And so just knowing the significance, New York Times ran an obituary of him when he was killed. He was that nationally known. So have some materials connected to Dixon Terry and the farm crisis, and how Iowans took different perspectives during the farm crisis as well. That's always one of the challenges, is trying to bring in some of those nuances of history. And in the case of Dixon Terry, he was certainly a very vocal advocate for reform in American agriculture. Then the last section is dealing from 1987 up to the present. As I said, we look at floods, new immigrants, and green energy. And in that section, we have a couple of flood-related artifacts, a can opener sent by a Baptist church, in Arkansas to Des Moines in 1993. It's actually a 6-pack with the Red Cross symbol on it from Anheuser-Busch water. That's from the Missouri River flood of 2019. And then the Iowa Lakes Community College from up at Estherville was one of the first, if not the first college to have a program in windmill, wind turbine maintenance. And so we've got a hard hat that was given to Governor Vilsack, and then again, connecting to alternative fuels or green energy poster from the Iowa Corn Promotion Board connected to ethanol production. And talking about new immigrants, this is part of the Southeast Asian community from Mahaska County, Shoa Hare. I may be mispronouncing her name and apologies for that, but we have a number of artifacts from her. She was still making traditional textiles into the 1990s, and actually went to the Folklife Festival, excuse me, in 1996 for the state's sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary. Knowing that there were immigrants from Central Europe coming to Iowa in the post-1990s, especially the Bosnia area, and then Central America, people coming to Iowa playing important roles in our state, and also African immigrants with an eye coming to our state. And so the photo that's represented on the main panel is a African community and some of the support network out of Polk County. We also do, as part of our 175th, talk about the role of arts and film as part of the Department of Cultural Affairs. We're honored to have as our colleagues the Iowa Arts Council and Produce Iowa. And so through the exhibit also talk about arts and film production. Film doesn't kick in until that nationwide settlement period. But by 1894, there were moving pictures. It was very late 1894, but they were moving pictures being shown in our state. And then have the image of Shoa Hare there with a story cloth that she had as part of the Iowa Folklife Festival in 1996. Field of Dreams on the lower right panel. So really enjoyed working with our colleagues in the Iowa Arts Council led by David Schmitz and Liz Gilman with Produce Iowa on talking about the role of arts and film in our state. So you'll get some background on that history if you come to see the exhibit. And we also do have some current collecting. And so anybody who is paying attention, and I am wrapping up, we have been collecting things connected to the pandemic of the past year. A dozen egg carton that the family from Davis County put a little photocopied note inside talking about, they were excited maybe to have new customers as egg production was disrupted, but not so much from their family. So a Polk County purchased carton that had a little note inside it talking about the crisis of the pandemic. And then from Mitchell County up in Osage, Fox River makes some great socks, but one of their production plant manager reached out to us and offered us examples of the masks that sold quite well at the beginning of the pandemic. They're actually a really good product, not an endorsement, but we're privileged to add those to our collection. And so for watchers, attendees today or in the future, really would appreciate you if you have materials connected to Iowa history of any period, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We try to find ways to put things on display. We do have a website that shows the acquisitions. And just to wrap up, a couple of other recent acquisitions with the killing of George Floyd. There was a Black Lives Matter rally up in Spencer. I was able to connect with Ty Jackson, who's a Black man from Spencer and experienced racism in his youth and in his adulthood. And then his friend Brock Storm, who marched in the Black Lives Matter rally in Spencer. So we do try to represent the whole state in our storytelling. And so these are a couple of recent acquisitions from the Spencer, Iowa Black Lives Matter rally of June 2020. And so we look to Iowans to help us tell their stories. We appreciate the support of everyone paying attention today. And with that, just say, hey, we've got another program coming up on March 4th. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Leo. We have a few minutes to answer some questions at this time. Before I pose the first question, I want to remind our participants that you can still submit your questions through the Q&A feature. Now, we are on a schedule, so please note we may not be able to get to all of our questions before the end of the webinar today. But here's the first question for you, Leo. Are there any particular stories you wanted to include in this exhibit that wouldn't fit in the space?
As I said, when we were talking about the Vietnam era and what a transformative period that was for our nation and for our state, we do have some artifacts that will rotate in and out in that area. And so I do look for us to try to include some storytelling about Iowans' experience, both in service. We've got some great collections connected to some families and men who served mostly. I don't believe we have any collections related to women serving in Vietnam. So if you know someone who is a woman who served in U.S. forces in the Vietnam era, that's a story we really would like to have. And if there's a donation in the future, I'd really try to work that one in. So that's probably the biggest regret I have, is that we don't address the Vietnam War and the reactions in our state.
Now, of the hundreds of thousands of objects in the museum collection, how do you go about selecting artifacts for exhibits?
We really do try to represent the experiences of different Iowans. So that's always important to us. And then looking at different parts of the state, since we are the State Historical Museum and the State Historical Society, finding images from across the state or artifacts from across the state. That's why that Missouri Valley image was really important for us to include. Sometimes it's a little harder for us to, whether it be Page County, or I should say Mills or Fremont, some of the Southwest counties. I know we've got a really good Tabor artifact in our mobile museum, and in an indirect way, though it was given to a family in Cedar County, that Underground Railroad effort that came out of Mills and Fremont County in the Civil Bend and Tabor area. We have a powder horn that was attributed to one of the enslaved people who went through the Underground Railroad from Mills and Fremont County to Eastern Iowa. And so really work hard to try to find artifacts that represent the experiences of people all across our state from all different backgrounds. And so that's something we really try to focus on. And then look for things that are visually interesting, we hope, or good stories.
Now's our last question. But what are some tips for visiting the State Historical Museum of Iowa, and what would you suggest?
Yeah, the State Historical Museum is open from 9 to 4:30 Tuesday through Friday currently. And so if you were coming to visit, I would encourage you to maybe show up around 9:30 or 10 o'clock. If you've never been before, get a brief review from our excellent information desk staff who really are there to help you. And then we have two larger, older exhibits that maybe a person might be familiar with. It's Delicate Balance on the first floor, and You Gotta Know the Territory. Those exhibits, if you start with those will take a lot of time. And so I would suggest starting with a smaller display, whether it be Iowa People and Places, or maybe our Writing Through History exhibit, or possibly the Hollywood in the Heartland exhibit on the second floor. Those two are on the second floor. Those are all three good smaller exhibits, or Iowa History 101, Iowans at Home, Work, and Play. And so maybe doing one of the smaller ones, then going to a larger exhibit in the morning, taking a break in the middle part of the day, and coming back in the afternoon and exploring again a couple of smaller displays, and then something like You Gotta Know the Territory or Delicate Balance. Don't try to do Delicate Balance and You Gotta Know the Territory back to back. Those will wear you out. Look at some of our smaller, more recent exhibits. Civil War is a good one too.
That's great advice. And with that answer, this is all the time we have for today's webinar. I say this every time, but I think we all can agree it's been a very informative lunch, and I'm very excited for the new exhibit. We hope you all can visit this exhibit after it opens on March 5th. Also, thank you to everyone joining us today. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History Month webinars on Tuesdays and Thursdays in March. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as the Galli's Kids Club activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. Thank you all again for joining us today. Have a great afternoon. We look forward to virtually seeing you here again Thursday, March 4th for our second Iowa History Month webinar. Thanks, everyone.